most of BC is not, British Columbia is not treaty.
Right.
Yeah, most like I know my nation is not treaty. Treaty, we're in treaty negotiations, but we're not treaty. We haven't signed any treaties, and a lot of the communities, Indigenous communities out here in BC, have not signed them. And what's happening with the pipeline is the chiefs that were elected, certain chiefs in certain areas that were elected, signed agreements with the pipeline. What happened was the hereditary chiefs that, that the land that the pipelines are going to go through, that's their traditional territory. That's where they do their trapping, their their livelihoods. They were not part of those signings, and that's where that conflict is coming from, because if they did not include the hereditary chiefs, and so that the hereditary chief stood up and said, no, we're not allowing this.
Is there conflict between the elected and the hereditary chiefs?
All the time. Because what happens is, like a regular business, because every community is a business, basically. Like their band office is a business, and it's going to be treated as such. And the reason for that is because of Indian affairs. You always had your Indian agent, and so now we have chief and council, stuff like that. You also have the land-based people, the traditional hereditary chiefs that live off the land, that are part of that's their land base. They're not elected, they're hereditary. And most of the time they're not even talked to, they're not even in part of the discussions. So the elected officials for the community are the ones that are making the decisions for the community and the traditional territory, but the hereditary chiefs are not part of that. So that's where you get your conflict.
It seems to me that it's getting more like the elected chiefs or the generation that comes up is being more like Canadian civilization now, or European civilization. They're losing their ability to interact with losing their Indigenous or Native style society, I think is a better term. Do you
Originally,
know what I mean? Becoming more capitalistic, that sort of thing.
Also becoming more patriarchal.
Yeah.
We used to be matriarchal.
Right.
And like we had, the women were the ones that ran everything. You did have your chief and your warriors, and but since colonialism, we're no longer matriarchal. And that in itself has disrupted the entire circle, the Indigenous circle of life, because when you had the matriarchs making all the major decisions, and kind of like, I don't know if you can picture that, but you have your circle. In the center of the circle, you have your children and your elders. The next circle is your matriarchs. The next circle is your warriors. And each layer protected what was in the center, which was the future and the past. Oh. You have your children, your youth, your babies, but you also had your elders as one unit in the center. So you protected your future and your past. And so they were and now we don't have that anymore. Now we're back to us and them, where, I bring that up a lot because that is something that is very, very common. We're no longer community-based. We're no longer, we're scattered. Mm-hmm. And everybody's out for each other instead of out for one another, because that's what we were told growing up, protect yourself, get yourself situated, who cares what anybody else think of yourself.
That's right. Well, are there a few of the elders who still have a memory? I mean, they're aging out now. They must be in their 80s and older now, who have a memory of what happened and teach the children at all? or the
Um,
youth?
we like here in this community, we do have our cultural advisors, and we do bring our elders in, and we try to utilize our elders a lot. And unfortunately, we are losing them at a high rate.
Yes.
But we try to utilize our elders as much as we can to bring back the past and our traditional ways and things like that. There are some that were raised that are bringing forward that the traditional ways that are not elders yet, but to the amount of knowledge that's being lost every time we lose an elder is immense. So
Yeah, it's a real difficult thing because you lose your language and you lose your cultural practice, you lose the infrastructure of the culture, which, you know, like, let's face it, the colonial, you know, imperial British government and the follow-on, the Canadian government, has been doing that consistently with you since they've touched base. I guess you could say the French did the same thing in their time, and that's been a continuous, you know, degradation of your sort of Indigenous culture. And what happens is that now you have a federal system which basically does it, but it's perhaps less overtly bad, and then it creates that dependency and creates the alienation. And I think that's something that was really interesting when we talked before, is that you have, you know, you sort of have these very personal struggles, very, you know, for a small band of people. I mean, I guess your tribe's a couple of thousand people, a few thousand people, and
less than
you
that.
know, like, it's even less.
Yes.
Well, a few hundred or a few or 1,000, and it's like, you know, that's in my culture, that's an extended family. You know, that's you know, that's like a very small clan from a very small part of where I come from. And you know, the importance of all that stuff, that the residential school systems and lots of the other things, you know, creating two different bands inside your one band by saying you've got status, you've got the stick, and you've got nothing. You know, that's just a classic, you know, sort of white supremacist divide and conquer type situation, which has been done all over the world by the European empires. But, you know, to see it now and then to say, well, hey, how do you get that culture back into the center of that family, and how do you recreate that family, and then how do you grow it? It's really difficult, because they're not going to give you, you know, the lands that your people have roamed for, I'm guessing, thousands of years. That's, you know, that's not going to be part of the Canadian government's easy option. That's a stretch option, and I think, you know, one of the real exciting things with Indigenous culture in Canada is that maybe not the old culture, but definitely the new culture that you're starting to see. You have a lot of First Nations people being very active culturally in the modern sense of Canadian culture, and I think there's a lot more. Whereas I guess when your mum was growing up, to be Indigenous was a slur for most people looking at your family, whereas now it's probably starting to be seen as something of value and something that's precious to your country. So I guess that's sort of something I'm interested in, you know, how your kids and how your grandkids are going to interact with that, you know.
I'm trying to, when it comes to acknowledging First Nations and the impact and anything like that, you see it in the media. You get the shock value, like when Kamloops 215 came up, you got the shock value, like, oh my God, look what happened, you know. But slowly, being Indigenous doesn't sell subscriptions, it doesn't sell magazines, it doesn't sell any kind of media, anything. they'll use it for the shock value at the beginning, but once that shock value is gone, we're just back to being Indigenous. We're just the token Indian, as far as my opinion. And so to see Indigenous communities trying their best to bring back culture and languages, and that is amazing to see. Like, we're seeing a lot of it in Canada and United States as well. But we're also still seeing that oppression portion that we cannot break out of yet. We're getting there, but we're just not there yet. And when things start looking like they're going good, it really isn't for us. Like, we're just waiting for the other shoe to fall. And because it's like the kid in the candy store, like the excitement, you get in there like, oh, we're doing this, and then you get told no. And that's pretty much what we are with the federal government. It's like they do a lot of lip service. They tell us, oh, we're going to do this with you, we're going to do this, you're going to do that, you're going to do that. When it comes right down to it, like the court system, our court system, we're overpopulated in the prison system, in the corrections. And they say they're going to do stuff to change it, and they say they're going to work on it. We're still waiting. And that's part of my job here, is to do my best to work with corrections and the court system to make sure that my members are, given a fair chance in there.
Do you think an Indigenous person is given, just like in the States, given a harder time in the court system compared to, let's say, European or Caucasian? I
do, yes.
Yeah.
As much as the system likes to say that that's not true, just the simple fact that we're overpopulated in the prison systems and corrections tells me otherwise. So
it's interesting. We had a guy who did a piece on policing in America, and he's got a book called The End of Policing. A professor called Alex Vitelli in New York. And the interesting thing would be to look at a lot of his premises on how the policing system was set up in the US, but it's transferable. And I think if you look at Canadian and imperial policing, a lot of it would have been set up to get the troublemakers off the reservations, to put a level of sort of keeping you in the reservation, keeping you docile as such. Because I imagine if it's anything like the American experience, you'd have had tribes who were doing their own thing until relatively recently, particularly in places like BC and in the central sort of plains areas. Is that those weren't heavily settled places from a white perspective or a European perspective until the late 1800s. So a lot of the actions that would have been done, I guess the Royal Mounties are a police force, but they're more like an armed militia, aren't they, really? But more like the Texas Rangers than the bobbies on the beat in London. And they're forms of oppression. Do the federal government even, I know in New Zealand, and I'm only using that because that's where I was brought up, so I have a bit of experience. Have they even taken on any customary sort of types of justice, like we do restorative justice in New Zealand, which comes from a sort of an Indigenous practice of how to, rather than just throw someone into jail and sort of punitively do it, you have situations where people meet their victims. You have community-based solutions rather than just, you're a bad person, I'll throw you away because you were caught drinking or something like that, or you've got a mental issue and you make too much noise, so we're going to throw you into prison. You know, do you have any type of interactions from the Canadian federal government that addresses the way, you know, your Indigenous culture addresses these issues?
Well, I don't know how many people are aware of the history with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They were big and one of the paramount people to be removing children from homes for the residential schools. They've actually come a long way, and they are working towards restorative justice for the most part. I'm lucky that I work closely with the 3 members that are here in my community here. And they are excellent. Like, they do everything in their power to not have to arrest somebody. They, you know, like they take a lot of their personal time to help with illiteracy. They learn to read. They do men's groups. Like, they're doing everything they can to build a relationship with us. And so I'm fortunate enough to be working along, like, with them as part of a team, because I'm in the justice. I'm the justice manager for the community, and so I work with them. I don't work for the federal government. I work for the band. I don't work with the police. We're kind of like a team. We do teamwork. We complement each other. Like, they do what they need to be doing. I do what I need to do. But our end goal is the same, is the safety protection of the people, as well as that relationship with the people. And so lucky for me, we have 3 great members here in community, and it could be different. Like, there are some members that, you know, are not, you know, as great as the ones that we have. But like, we've had previous ones where my mom considers them her children, and they still, you know, communicate. Like, mom, she, you know, like, she just loves them. And so the relationships are getting better as opposed to what they used to be. Because, you know, back when I was growing up, and this is personal experience, when I was growing up, the RCMP was something to be scared of, because the only time they came around was when they were taking someone to jail or they were going to beat somebody up. That was my experience with the RCMP growing up. I was petrified of them, scared of them. Why I started working in criminal justice, I don't know. But it's actually technically just to help my people, and that's what I'm doing now. But the more I learned about the RCMP, the more I seen their changes, the more I seen their mandates change, where they had to start working with the Indigenous people instead of against them. And the more I started seeing that even their mindsets are changing. So we've come a long way. They've come a long way. And I say we've come a long way too, because our mindset as Indigenous people, we did not want to interact with the RCMP because they were something to be feared. They were something to be, you know, hated. Just the uniform itself was to be hated. I grew up being told that they were bad. And so our mindsets have changed too. Like, we're now accepting RCMP detachments in our communities. We're working alongside of them, where you know, we both have expectations of each other on both sides, and we're living up to those. And so I think that there's a big shift. I think, and one of the things I'm doing for my department and for my community is all the restorative justice things that are currently out there that RCMP are doing, I'm wanting to bring into communities so that we can start utilizing those in the community as well. And New Zealand, actually, I really want to go down there and check out what they have for restorative justice, because there's a few things down there that I would like to utilize out here.
Yeah, I should connect you with some family down in New Zealand who are involved in that kind of stuff, because it's probably similar to what you're discussing, is that as the broader culture has accepted that, you know, the Indigenous people in New Zealand have been mistreated, then there's been more pressure. I think, you know, like there's different cases around particular areas, which I think is an example of what you're talking about with your relationship with the Mounties. I think it's the same in different communities and tribes in New Zealand, and it'd be great to, because I think that's something, particularly in the Anglosphere, is that you can share a lot of stuff because you're dealing with the same system of white supremacy. You know, it's exactly the same governments, you know, whether you're in South Africa or you're, you know, old South Africa, let's say, but yeah. South Africa or Australia, New Zealand, Canada, to an extent the US, you have the same types of political systems and cultural systems and justice systems, and I think that's a really important thing. You know, like as much as it's really important for every First Nation in BC to be talking to one another and sharing and helping each other, and across Canada, it's also really important to work with other Indigenous groups, particularly in areas where there is that, you know, Anglo-colonial, you know, sort of government in place, you know, because most of them aren't that sort of reformed. I think New Zealand,
yeah.
You know,
well, I know
New Zealand's
that,
maybe a little bit more than Australia, but
I know that
still got problems.
Alberta has adopted bringing the eagle feather into the courtrooms across Alberta, which is significant for Indigenous courts because for us, the eagle feather is sacred because that's closest to the Creator, and to you know, rather than swear on the Bible, you know, the eagle feather to us is more sacred than swearing on the Bible, and so it was great to see that they started doing that in Alberta. So, and you know, there's some areas, some jurisdictions are coming up with Indigenous court as well. So those are, we're coming around, or they're coming around. But and I usually say we or me or, you know, things like that only because I worked on both sides. I started my career off in the judicial system in the big city of Edmonton, and now I'm here in a small community, and so I've worked in both worlds. I worked in the colonial world, and now I'm working in the First Nation world. So
I think that's the pull of a lot of natives, Indigenous people, is the pull of both worlds, right? What was before and what you have to live in now.
Yes.
And how do you come to terms with that, right?
Yeah, and for someone like me, because I came back an outsider for all intents and purposes, because I wasn't raised on reserve. I wasn't my mom kept us off reserve as much as she could because she didn't want us to be taken away by the Indian agents and thrown in residential schools. She didn't want that for us. So she did not teach us our history. She did not teach us our language. She did not teach us anything that has to do with being First Nations. So we were raised, and I keep using this word, and I don't mean to make it sound bad, but we were raised white. So, you know, we were not raised Indigenous or anything like that. So any of that learning we've learned as we started growing up, but when we were kids, she did her best to keep us away from that, for obvious reasons, like she was scared that, you know, we'd be taken away as well. But so every time I've come back to the community, I was always the outsider. So when I came back to actually work here, there was a lot of people that were like, well, who's that? You know, like they went and hired another white person. And so, you know, like, even though I've got my card saying that I'm a status Indian, I'm still effectively an outsider because I was not raised around. And, and then it wasn't until people started going, oh, that's Julie's daughter, or, then they started going, oh, okay, like she's a member, okay. But, in some instances, I'm still that outsider because, I go to talk to somebody and they're looking at me like, what, like, who are you to tell me, whatever, like, you don't belong here. And I still get that every now and then, but I think I'm wearing off on people. I'm wearing them down, I think. But yeah, so I lived in both worlds, and because we did come up here and stay up here for a while, but we were outsiders when we were up here, and but I had the luxury of living in both worlds. So.
Okay. Well, that's about an hour. It's been great.
Sorry, I don't know that.
Oh, it's my Alexa. Let me just share with you though. So this map here, apparently, this is where they found graves of Indigenous children in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And that is quite the map. And I believe they're going through the United States right now with radar or LiDAR.
Yeah, in some areas they are. Yeah, I believe the unmarked grave count in Canada was over 7,000 now, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
I remember seeing something about that, and also there was a lot of this is just outside of Edmonton. I think it's outside Marathon, Alberta.
Yeah.
On the side of the road, they had 7,000 flags, orange flags. It was quite the scene that it was, you could, when you drove by it, your heart just sank. It was like, because each one of those flags represented a child. So it was
Right.
like, it was.
And especially anybody who's been to Mayerthorpe, you don't want to go there. So
Yes.
I'm just saying.
I think it was just outside there. So.
But
I've actually never been in that community. I've just driven by it. So.
No, they got a baseball team out there, so we used to play against them.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, these children, so you got parents at home, they've sent their children to residential school. Maybe occasionally they come back for Christmas. One year they just don't come back. And the parents don't know what happened to the children. And I would think the Natives Affairs agent said, oh, I don't know. I'm assuming they wouldn't fess up to what happened to the child because they didn't know, apparently. And some of the film we've seen, like that movie that you recommended.
We Were Children, yes.
We Were Children, just
yes.
an awe-inspiring depth of knowledge of what Native children went through, and I think it could have been even worse. That was kind of sanitized for
yes.
the video. It was actually worse crimes that happened to these children.
Yes.
But you're as a parent, you don't know what happened to your child, and as far as Native culture goes, your family's everything, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, the children, the elders.
Yeah.
Matriarch.
For the most part, if your child didn't come back home from school, if you inquired about it, depending on how much you inquired about it, you would be labeled like the troublemaker.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in back in those days as well, you weren't allowed to leave the reserve unless you had permission from the Indian agent. So you couldn't even go check to find out where your child is or what happened to your child unless the Indian agent said you were allowed to go.
Wow.
Because if you left without the permission, you were jailed.
Prisoner on your own land.
Yes. And so it's, it was the time of the First Nation lives that even asking if your child is okay was an issue for the Indian agents.
Right.
And you never got answers. No one ever told you whatever happened to your child. I just actually heard, I think it was about 2.5 weeks ago, a mother, this was in our parliament actually, a mother finally, after, I don't know, like 50 years, found out where her child was buried.
50 years.
50, yeah.
Can't
I
even-
believe it was 40 or 50 years, but it was in Parliament in Canada that it was announced. And the only reason why it was announced is because one of the First Nations senators brought it to the Parliament. So.
Well, I want to thank you guys. I think it actually warrants a further conversation. I find this fascinating, and anything we can do to get the message out to Canadians, especially and North Americans actually, about what's happened. And I think there has to be some sort of restorative justice that is real and not just prime ministers saying, oh, okay, we did the truth and reconciliation thing, everybody back to business. So I think we have to step forward as a country and we have to deal with this. The treaties, the land, everything, let's just deal with it and then we can all move on as a nation.
Well, one of the things is we can bring, Nazi war crimes into court now, but we can't bring residential school genocide crimes into court. There hasn't been any charges brought forward. There is nothing. So our voices are still not being heard.
I'm very impressed with that point, Dianne. I actually am. You're right on the money there. Is there anything you'd like to say to end this, Roriki, at all, or are you good?
I'd just like to thank you, Walter, for giving the platform to speak about this, and thank you to Dianne and to her family and to her culture for existing and not having been subsumed by this genocide. So it's a real pleasure to hear your story and to share your story and hopefully to find in the Polynesian culture we have this concept which is called whakapapa, which means it's like your lineage, but it's seen as a thread which goes back into your past, it's your present, and it's your future. So, I think that's a really important concept for us, and something, that I give to your culture is just think about your existence now in that terms, because it gives you the spirit not to give up, to keep fighting. So.
Okay, well, thank you.
That's one thing we do is we do fight. We don't give up. So.
No, hey. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks for listening to North of 48, and I'd like to thank Roriki, and I'd like to especially thank Dianne. It's an important topic, the residential schools, the sacrifices these families have made, and the sacrifice of these children. Take care. Till next time. Bye.